Hello and welcome to Exotic Gardening UK Yorkshirekris Weekly, and on this episode, on this pretty windy, blustery late autumn day, we're going to talk about tree ferns. Dicksonia antarctica, the most common type of tree fern that's grown in the UK and Northern Europe. We're going to talk about what to look for when buying a plant, how to keep it healthy, and also generally how to look after them through the winter as well. So behind me I've got my little mini tree fern forest where I've got about, I think, 6 or 7 planted out, including a couple of double trunked ones. And these, although it's a really windy day, in quite a sheltered position, because around me I've got a hedge on one side, I've got a large laurel which bears the brunt of all the wind on the other side. I've got a big eucalyptus tree providing shelter above, and other plants around the garden. So these plants are not getting buffeted too much by the wind, although they are feeling the effects just behind me a little bit. And these plants really want still air, really, sort of a cool, shady spot. And the reason they want that is because they are ferns and they like the high humidity, the high moisture in the air, and they don't want to be disturbed by winds because the fronds are quite delicate, and it just helps them maintain their growth because the roots come out of the trunks all the way from the top down to the ground and into the ground, and they need to be moist so that the water can get into the roots that are on the trunks and go up into the crown and feed the tree fern and give it moisture. And these tree ferns behind me have been in for a few years now, and as you can see, they've got lovely long fronds, and these are, some of them are about 2 meters long. The actual plants themselves, the trunks, are not too high. Some are about 60 centimeters, some are less, some are up to about 120 centimeters, so they vary in height. But what they've all got is these cool, shady conditions which allow them to grow really well. Now, often when you buy a tree fern, what you're getting is not a plant with nice green fronds. You're often getting just a trunk. So you're just getting the brown, just like a stump, doesn't look alive at all, with all the leaves that have been cut off before they've been transported halfway around the world, from Australia, New Zealand, Tasmania, and they've come in ships, and then they have been pretty dry for many months. And when you get them, you get this quite a dry, spongy, corky material that you've got to turn into a tree fern. And basically by watering it really well, and in spring and summer, you'll get the leaves emerging. And they come with no roots in any soil. They come as these stumps, and you need to plant them. You can plant them on the surface and stake them, or ideally plant them with some depth and in good, free draining, humus rich soil and compost. And you can, like I said, stake them so they don't fall over, and then over the season they'll grow roots that will stabilise them, and the fronds will emerge as well. And the first flush of fronds that you get in their first season, once they've been transported around the world, are normally pretty big, quite spectacular, because all the energy they've had from their growing conditions in their native habitat have meant that they've gone into the rhizome, into the actual trunk, and then they've just erupted once you've watered them well, and have this big flush of greenery. Now, our job in this country, once you've planted them, is to maintain that vigour, maintain those beautiful long fronds, and continually get the new fronds keep as big as the previous fronds. And to do that, you need to grow it in ideal conditions or water it religiously, absolutely every day, and keep that trunk moist. The main thing with these ferns, and pretty much most ferns really, ground ferns, they like to be kept moist. They like the high humidity. They don't like the air moving about too much, so they want somewhere sheltered ideally. You might often see people growing them in really sunny conditions, which is fine if you water them lots and lots and lots and lots. Now, doing that is not ideal. You can grow it like that, but you're just sort of keeping the plant alive, keeping it going, but it's not really flourishing. To get really great tree ferns, you need to grow them with some shade, some shelter, and you still need to water them a lot. If you live in really rainy areas, so Cornwall, the west coast, west side of Scotland, where it rains lots and lots, then you don't need to water them too much because you get plenty of rainfall. On the east side of the country or the central areas, then you do need to irrigate them well or water them really well with either sprinklers, watering cans, or as I've done on these, I've actually put up little pipes around onto the tree ferns, and then the water goes up when I turn the tap on, and little sprinklers at the top near the crowns water them, and I leave them on for a long time in summer when it's hot, and it just percolates down and waters the outside of the tree fern. And by doing that, it keeps it nice and moist. That is even in this sort of shady area. That means these, like I said, have been in for 5 years now, and they have flourished, and every year get really long fronds. If you've bought one and it's done well 1 year, and then the next year it's got shorter fronds and shorter and really tight crown, it's because you've grown it really in not the right location. You need to move it somewhere more sheltered, more shady, and or water it far more. I want to show you some other tree ferns that I've got in the garden, some that are not doing as well as these, and one that's doing even better than these, and explain to you why they are in those states they are. Now, believe it or not, there's a great big tree fern just behind me. It's a bit hard to see because this year I've grown these cup and saucer vines, Cobaea scandens, up it, and these have been very vigorous and covered the trunk and, to be honest, all the fronds. So ignore that for now, but if you look at the tree fern itself, you can see that it's a huge one. You know, this is well over 2.5 meters tall, and these fronds though are not too big. These are only, I think, about 50, 60, 70 centimeters long. So nowhere near as big as the fronds that were shown you on the much smaller tree ferns in ideal locations at the back of the garden. I want to talk about why this is the case, because it is in a pretty sheltered location, got a huge bank of bamboos all around it on these sides where all the wind comes in, and I do water this really well. Although it's not irrigated with a pipe, this is basically every day I use a sprinkler, or I'll put a watering can over it in summer or when it's hot. The reason this is not growing really well is because it wasn't bought when the imports came into UK. So I mentioned earlier that normally you buy them just as trunks, and you get them sort of early in the season because they normally come January to sort of April. You often get a lot of new fresh stock in the nurseries that do stock these. If you buy them straight away, you can give them the ideal conditions that I've mentioned earlier. This one was bought after, I think, at least a season of being at a nursery where it had not been looked after as well as it could have been. So it'd been very dry, so it's been through hot months without enough water to really keep it really happy. And obviously no roots. It's been kept as just a stump basically for many months before it was purchased. And it's meant that the fronds that have come out are really small. It'll only grow fronds as big as what the rhizome, which is inside the trunk, can cope with. If it's got enough energy, it'll grow big fronds. If it's not got that much energy, because it's not been watered well enough, then it'll only produce small fronds. And the small fronds also mean that where they come out at the top, at the crown, it can close the crown up a bit because it's getting smaller, because it's not an ideal location. So you want it to have a nice big open crown so that the fronds have space to move out and also keep it nice and wide. On this one, it's really wide at the basis because when it's been growing back down under, it's at ideal conditions by the looks of things, and it's got a nice wide trunk about this wide here, and then as it goes up, it's gone quite thin where it's not had as good conditions, and then come to the UK, and because it wasn't looked after for a season or so, it's struggling. So this is sort of on life support. I'm trying to get it back to open the crown. So if you do buy one late in the season that you don't think it's been looked after too well and the fronds are small, then don't buy it. Only buy ones either early in the season or where it's been potted up and it's been looked after really well, and you can see it's got really large fronds, and when you touch the trunk it feels moist. If it feels bone dry, really light, then avoid it if you can. That said, like I said, the ones that get imported early in the season are going to be very dry, but that's okay as long as you look after it as soon as you buy it and its first fronds emerge. They're going to be good, and you're going to keep on top of the watering regime. So this one isn't doing too great, but fingers crossed over the next few years, if I keep on top of the watering, it will start producing larger fronds. If next season the fronds are getting smaller and smaller because it's just not recovered from that really dry period a few years ago, and it might see the demise of this tree fern, unfortunately. Right, I want to show you a tree fern that is truly happy with the conditions and showing you the ideal location to plant a tree fern. Now, this is my best growing and happiest tree fern. It's not the biggest, but it's by far the happiest. It's in the best location in the garden. It doesn't get drip irrigation. It doesn't get watered as regular as my other tree ferns, but it's in the perfect growing conditions. It's in a quite humus rich, well sort of dug over soil that I put lots of organic material in before I planted it, and it's in a very shady location. So it's surrounded by trachycarpus palms above it, bamboos, and it's got other tree ferns. Not too far behind there's a brick wall as well, and this is sort of, well, looking that way, that's north, so it's in a nice shady location, and because it's sheltered, the ground is moist as well, and we don't get a big breeze in this area, then it's performing at its absolute best. So this was planted as a very small stump. Talked about the stumps earlier. It was bought as, it's called a 1 footer, so it was about 30 centimetres, and I decided to actually plant this one about half underground and half above ground. So this is the original height of the plant, about here, and then all this growth has been over the last 7 years. So when we think about tree ferns, we often think about them as being a really slow growing plant, which they are pretty slow growing, but they grow consistently, and if they've got ideal location and conditions, then they'll grow actually pretty fast. So let's get my tape measure out and have a look at this. So the original height are these, is from about there. So let's just look at that. So that is about, let's go back to the ground. Okay, so it's about 15 centimetres about here, and then it's grown, hold that a bit straighter, all the way up to now 55 centimetres where we get to the top of the growing point is. So it's grown 40 centimetres. Let's double check that. Yeah, 40 centimetres in 7 years. Okay, so that's pretty good going. And why is it so happy? Like I mentioned, it's sheltered and it's kept moist. The main reason is the trunk has remained moist every day of the year. And what that's encouraged is, if you look carefully, you can see actually roots on the outside of the trunk, and these are formed when it's nice and humid and moist in the air, so that it can actually get moisture from the atmosphere and when it lands on the trunk, as well as the roots that are in the ground. And not only is it in the old part of the trunk, it's in the new part of the trunk. All the way up here you've got roots forming here as well, and it just shows you how happy it is. When you've got an unhappy tree fern, or a tree fern that's doing okay, you know, it's growing well but it's not in tip-top condition, you won't get all these roots growing down to the ground on the outside. You'll probably just get them sort of a bit corky and dry on the outside. So this shows you these roots, it's really happy in this location, and if I push it, put some weight on it, that is absolutely solid. So that is really grown well into the ground. The roots will spread out in all directions. If I try to dig a hole here, it'd be very difficult because there's so many of these fibrous roots. And the crown, the leaves on this thing, it's hard to see in this little video, but they are pretty huge. They're over 2 meters, even though it's just a small plant. And each season it produces 2 or 3 flushes of these leaves, and you've got lots and lots of the leaves. I mean, this has got easily, what, 50 leaves grown this year. I had a few die off. You see, a couple of here died off when it was a frost earlier in the year, obviously in spring, but then it's produced all these other fronds and these leaves. So this is what healthy tree fern looks like, and hopefully with a bit of care with my other tree ferns, they'll eventually grow roots on the outside and be as healthy as this one. But this is what you're looking for. You want a nice plant that's happy in its location, sturdy in the ground, lots of roots on the outside, nice dark colour, nice and sort of wet to the touch, lots and lots of fronds, and the fronds are really long. Now when it comes to winter care, as you can see, the tree fern's helping itself here by collecting debris, bit of old leaves, fronds, old leaves from other plants. So we've got a leaf here from a bush and twigs and things, and that just insulates the crown. It keeps the moisture in there as well, and it stops any frost and ice especially sort of going into the crown and sort of killing the new leaves and potentially killing the full plant if it gets to really low temperatures. These can go down to -10 for short periods, but they don't really want to go anywhere near below -5 ideally. You can insulate the full plant, you can wrap straw around it and fleece and cover the whole thing if it gets really cold, but definitely don't do that too early, because you've got to remember, you've got to keep this moist, and if it's completely covered in synthetic materials or waterproof materials, then it will dry out over winter, and it will probably survive, but it won't grow as well the following year. So I like to put straw in these, straw in the crowns when it gets cold, probably in December, and then if it gets really cold I will cover it over in fleece, but then just check on it every few weeks just to make sure that it's still moist in there. And looking at the fronds, obviously they're green, and they will stay green unless it gets about, it's not about -3, 4 or 5 when they'll bronze off on mature fronds. On freshly emerging fronds, like the ones in spring, they'll just die off at 0 or even 1 degrees. Once they're nice and mature and hardened off, then they'll stay green down to sub-0. If these blacken off, then I'll cut all the fronds off and protect the plant for the rest of the winter. If they remain green, then the plant's not been too cold, and therefore I'll just keep the fronds on all winter and just protect the crown. When it comes to actually feeding tree ferns, they don't really need any food at all. You can actually buy tree fern fertiliser if you wish, but it's not really necessary. But naturally do accumulate leaves in the crown. So as you can see in this example of this tree fern, there's loads of what's mainly bamboo leaves in this instance, and that will slowly rot down and add nutrients around and into the crown of the tree fern. I do sometimes put like 2 or 3 chicken pellets in spring in the crowns, but it's not really necessary at all. I only do that if I'm fertilising other plants in the immediate vicinity, and they just naturally grow well when they're getting leaf fall from other plants, and that will rot down and give the tree fern all the nutrients it needs. Of course, you do need to grow them in the right soil, so a soil that's humus rich. If you had lots of compost or rotted leaf mold or something like that into soil before planting, and then when you're sort of generally gardening around the tree ferns year on year, if you add some mulch, so again a bit more compost or leaf mold, a bit of mulch, something organic like that, and that can gently rot down around the basin of the soil of the tree fern and add extra nutrients and increase the fertility of the soil. Now, thanks for watching this edition of Exotic Gardening UK, where we've looked at tree ferns and everything that they like. So hope you found this video interesting and informative, and if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe with the icon below, and join me next week where we're doing more in the garden.